Hello, good to have you here. I'm Felicity Ezewuike. Welcome to One Slot. The Forum on China-Africa Cooperation recently ended. It has become the most important event on the African international relations calendar as more African leaders attend these summits than the United Nations General Assembly. Data confirms this. The three-day event took place against a backdrop of challenges in China-Africa relations. Africa's debt to China remains a sticking point. Since its inception, China has promised tens of billions of dollars in aid, investment, and loans to African states, leading to assertions that the forum is a platform for China to dole out aids and loans to African countries and to articulate priorities that serves its own broader ambitions. Analysts, however, lay the fault lines with Africa's lack of a strategy for engagement with China. The theme this year was joining hands to advance modernization and build a high-level China-Africa community with a shared future. But how shared can that future be between the Asian economic giant and Africa? Well, to help us review Africa's presence at the forum, the China-Africa relations and cooperation strategies in the first half of this program today is co-founder Veriv Africa, Basil Abia. Basil, thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here again, Felicity. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I enjoyed the last time, so I'm looking forward to today. Let's begin with your assessment of Africa's showing at the just concluded Forum on China-Africa Cooperation.
Yeah, I think first and foremost, you have to be able to articulate what the FOCAC summit is in clear terms from a geopolitical perspective. It's part of the CCP's broader ambitions with regards entrenching China as a global power. And they have this thing where they call it the, if I'm not mistaken, the Zonge Wolu. It's basically Mandarin for comprehensive national power. And the CCP uses this philosophical standpoint to highlight its ambitions to be able to be a global economic and socio-political power. And one of the ways that they're doing that is to entrench their stranglehold on the African continent with the volumes of trade, of aid that they're enabling and trade that they're also enabling. A lot of China-Africa relations analysts and myself also included, we can highlight that it's a very top-heavy arrangement. And we have seen that again with the recently concluded FOCAC summit, where largely most of the agenda and most of the deliberations were, largely led by Beijing. The entire CCP high-level frameworking arrangement that was, generated by the CCP bureaucrats. And we see that in the outcomes as well, the outcomes of the deal itself. First and foremost, we all know that the credit line deal that China are given to Africa is about 50.7 billion US dollars if you convert it from the yuan rate. And then amidst that 50.7 billion US dollars, over 30 billion US dollars are direct credit lines. And while we can say that there's some improvements in the non-aid portfolio of that particular package, which includes technology transfer, for instance, the over 30 clean energy projects that they're going to set up, the laboratory and study research centers that they're also setting up in Africa, studying a plethora of diseases, especially tropical diseases. At least we can highlight that there's an improvement in terms of the technology transfer and the involvement of African capital. They're also going to resume their training of African talent, most especially African students for undergraduate and graduate studies. They're also changing their non-interference standpoint policy, where they barely involve themselves in African governance. This time they're training African political party elites. So we can say that from the FOCAC summit, there's a slight detour from what happened in Dhaka in 2021, where the policy arrangement there, or the strategic arrangement there was market access and value chain addition. This time around is more capacity building, more technology transfer, of course, more governance intrusions in that sense. But again, like always with the FOCAC summit, since they started being an item in the year 2000, it has largely been a top-down heavy or top-heavy approach from the Chinese government, where they're dictating literally every sphere of the deliberations of the summit. And that's my overview of the summit.
Oh, thank you very much. I actually got some new information from what you said, because most of the conversation has been around, this transfer of technology and the imbalance that seems to be that, when China brings contracts or projects to Africa, they also come with their own people, and then we just do maybe the organizing and stuff. But it's great to hear that the conversation is moving beyond talk. But then again, there is another part of the conversation where people say that China is the most significant trading partner that Africa has. What is your perspective here? Is that true? And if it is, should we be worried?
Well, first and foremost, according to the statistics, definitely China is Africa's biggest trade partner. And significantly as well, China is now a dominant feature in our debt problem, or our continent-wide debt crisis. Over 13% of the debt, Africa's public and private debt that we owe, China is responsible for that lending. So yeah, if we're going to talk about the African debt trap situation, we definitely have to talk about China. They're now playing a pivotal role. In fact, our debt bill right now with China as a continent is about 696. But it's actually more than that. But the last relevant data around our debt holding with China is that we owe the Chinese at the very least $696 billion US. So while they're our biggest trade partner, they're also one of our biggest, I would say, debt holders in that sense. And that's the geopolitical risk as a continent. We have to find ways to de-risk that by a lot more diversification, also accessing financing other than that of aid or credit lines from other hegemonies, whether it be the West or be it the East, in this context, China, or in fact, another country in the East that is also trying to become more dominant in arrangements with the African continent, Russia, as we have noted with the last Russia conference or summit in that sense. But let me just highlight that one of the ways African governments, and especially the African Union, can de-risk from being, beholden to these global powers in terms of debt holdings, is to be able to find ways to continue to galvanize African governance to look inwards, start to push for more debt, more domestic revenue mobilization.
I'm sure that's part of what I'll be asking you, how we're going to achieve that, pushing for more for Africa, and us having a coordinated approach, because that's where our failing seem to lie mostly. But there's something you said I'd like to explore. I was keeping this conversation, this particular question for my second guest, but I think we should get your perspective as well. You mentioned the debt ratio in that relationship, and some say it is not a symbiotic one. It's gone more to say that it is exploitative, and the claims are that it is a debt trap diplomacy. I want you to speak on that. You must have heard this before.
Yeah, I mean, if you're in the Africa-China knowledge space, definitely you'd hear about the theory, the debt trap theory. If you ask for my own opinion, I think it's more than that, and there needs to be nuance around that arrangement. I don't think there's an elaborate strategy from Beijing, for instance, to want to put Africa in a debt trap. I think it's a consequence of the arrangement. Like I said, it's a top-heavy approach from Beijing, and Africa doesn't, because of Africa's lack of a coherent China approach or China strategy, we're now seeing ourselves vulnerable in this type of arrangement. First and foremost, as we have noted with Angola, as we have noted with Zambia, as we have noted with Uganda, and even Kenya, the Chinese are not very nice when it comes to negotiating debt relief. They want to get as much as possible whenever they give, and sometimes that means also taking over assets so they can recoup whatever it is that they have given in. So yes, it's not a symbiotic or a mutually beneficial arrangement, but it's also inaccurate to say that Beijing has this elaborate or coherent strategy where they want to make the entirety of the African continent be beholden to them in sort of like a debt trap arrangement. I don't think that's accurate. I think it's just a consequence. We're seeing that debt holding, for instance, the 13% debt holding that we're seeing as a continent to China. We're seeing that because that's the consequence of the arrangement. And until we are able to come up with our own coherent Africa-China strategy as a continent and as individual or respective African countries, we're going to continue to see that happen. We're going to see a Zambia happen. We're going to see a Kenya happen, where you have to renegotiate the debt deals, and sometimes we will see them take over some key assets because they want to recoup whatever they have put in terms of debt financing.
Okay. Again, you're taking me away from the original script. You talk about us not having a strategic plan, and I did mention that that's one of our problems. China has had theirs all sorted since 2016. So what is our problem? Why are we not being able? The AU is part of this meeting. The AU is supposed to be, the mouthpiece of a collective decision that is taken here in Africa. But that doesn't seem to be the case. What must we do if we need to, get up and have a better speaking voice?
Well, yeah. What we can do is definitely look at some low-hanging fruits. As a matter of fact, there is a cohort of over 6,000 African China experts, China analysts, folks who have significant experience with the Chinese from a government perspective and from a private perspective. That network of 6,000 African technocrats is somewhere around the range of engagement that the African Union, as well as other organizations that work in periphery or work basically in the same space as the African Union, should be able to take on. So engage that 6,000 member network. It's there. They are part of the arrangements, and some of them were very key brokers during the FOCAC summit that just recently concluded in Beijing. So once you start that engagement, you can either join the network or set up a different forum where a core part of that 6,000 member network, join the AU-led forum and have, of course, the sub-regional organizations like the SADC, like the ECOWAS, and the Central African Economic Council, having all these sub-regional bodies together with that 6,000 member network, under the auspices of the African Union. They'll be able to set up a China-Africa forum, or an Africa-China forum, basically, that dominates the conversations from the African perspective, but also comes up with should it be more than 50 pages, to be honest, but at least a single document that highlights what the strategy should be in the next 10 to 20 years with China. And let's ensure that it aligns with the Agenda 2063, the African Union. The African Union has this very elaborate and coherent strategy and agenda for growth in the next 40 years, where they want to accomplish a number of things.
Okay.
For instance, and aligning that with the Africa-China strategy is commonsensical right now.
Okay, something that came up in the Agenda 2063 is for Africa. China has theirs, I think, 2035 all set out. Yes. And apparently China is supposed to help us accomplish most of this goal and make us sort of economic giants in no time, the continent. But the thing is, their primary goal is to have this global power. So how is it that they are actually going to work to help us achieve a similar position? Is it more that they are not, worried about Africa overtaking them, or it is, I don't know, what do you make of that? Because it is worrisome. Somebody's wanting to help you achieve a goal in 2063 when their personal goal is to dominate you.
Well, I think you have to look at it from a what's in it for me perspective. So if another, let's use a personal relationship now. If another person, if I tell another person in the context of what I want to do in terms of my own personal ambitions, that this is what I want to do, and I want to align with your own ambitions to also do a number of things, the other person or the other party is going to ask the question, what's in it for me? So in this context, if we bring this metaphor now to that of China and Africa, for China, the first thing they're going to ask is what is in it for them in terms of the 2063 Africa agenda. And a number of things can align. First and foremost, it means that China has a far more fast-tracking framework with which they can continue their infrastructure dominance on the continent. part of that 2063 agenda is having a African electricity pool, basically an African electricity grid network that can help generate as much power and transmit as much power as possible and have diverse electricity markets compete together in one space. And on the fulcrum of that particular African electricity pool is the construction of the Grand Inga Dam in DR Congo. It's going to be about 40,000 megawatts in terms of electricity generation, which is massive for the African continent. We're a very energy poor, electricity poor continent. So for the African Union, they want to be able to see that Grand Inga Dam become a reality. And then the Chinese will be looking at that deal as something really nice, because it basically means that their CECC or any other of their state engineering corporation, maybe the Chinese Harbor Engineering Corporation, for instance, can get that deal. That's big money. If you're building a 40,000 megawatts hydroelectric power plant and you insert your own state-owned corporation, you're making a very good, juicy deal. And then let's not forget that part of that deal might be a 30-year concessional deal. And that 30-year concessional deal means that they can recoup whatever investments they're making in that hydroelectricity plant and make so much money. So the life cycle of return on investment for that deal is humongous. I'm not even thinking they're going to make that a 30-year concessionary deal. I think it will be a 50-year concessionary deal. So half of a century of either the Chinese Harbor Engineering Corporation or the Chinese Civic or Central Engineering Corporation, for instance, is a good deal, not only for the corporation, but even for Beijing's agreement. And then think of these infrastructure deals that are highlighted in the 2063 agenda. China will be looking at all of them to say, you know what, we want to make sure that we're in that entire framework. We're building, we're constructing, we're operating, and we're not transferring. Or if we're doing the transferring, it's happening after 30, 40, 50 years. At the end of the day, our agenda to become a dominant economic and global power is basically going to make China a global power before we eventually reach that height. So at the end of the day, again, because of the top-heavy arrangement, because of China having a lot of advantages in terms of technology, in terms of liquidity, and in terms of political savviness, China are going to take advantage of that agenda. So the agenda actually isn't going to, if we engage with them fully, China has a lot more to benefit than Africa.
I really don't know what to say, because you just validated some of the things that I have seen flying around, and that is of concern from my very layman's perspective. But let's look at the positives for a bit, and then we'll come back to taking, if we have time, still talking about how we can synergize and speak with one voice. In what ways is Africa actually, maybe you could give us examples, if any comes to mind, are we gaining from this interaction, this partnership, allegedly, in terms of technology transfer, in terms of investment? You know, maybe just a couple of highlights to add to what you've already said.
I think we can highlight it with a number of key projects that has been funded by Beijing as aftermath of the FOCAC summits, for instance, from Dakar and now. We can highlight, of course, that for the first time in a long time, Nigeria now has a functioning seaport, a deep seaport. I mean, it's not at optimal level in terms of activation, but without China, we wouldn't have had the Lekki deep seaport. There's no doubt about that. We can highlight that the Zungeru hydroelectric power plant, for instance, that has now come onto life, is giving us adding at least 700 megawatts to our grid. Would not have been possible without Chinese help, without Chinese aid help. And we can also highlight that a core of the 1,000 kilometer rail infrastructure that we've added to our rail infrastructure stock in the last 10 years, especially when we look at the Abuja-Kaduna Railway and we look at the Warri-Itakba Railway, for instance, and then the Lagos to Abeokuta rail line, as well as the revamping of the narrow gauge line in the southeast, would not have been possible without Chinese aid. And we can talk about that of the SGR in Nairobi-Mombasa, the Nairobi-Mombasa SGR rail line, the Tanzania one that has just been completed. We can go over and over the entire continent, a number of power plants that they've built, a number of roads, expressways that they've built, a number of rail lines that they continue to build, the seaports that they're
it all
building.
sounds great, but do you have any fears? All this sounds positive and very beneficial, I mean, candidly, but are there underlying fears with these investments that China is, I mean, we're already indebted to them, but are there any concerns that comes to mind as to why we might begin to consider treading with more caution than we currently are displaying?
Well, like I said, using the examples from Zambia, using the examples from Kenya in terms of debt, lack of debt remediation, the Chinese are actually harsher when it comes to not reaching your debt commitments, for instance. They're harsher than the West, I'll be honest. And one of their core strategies that we're seeing them use over the last 5 years is that they take over those assets until they are able to recoup. And sometimes they recoup even more than they've put in that context. So yeah, not really tread carefully in that sense. But like I said, a coherent strategy that enables for more technology transfer, for more capacity building, and enables more African dictation. So Africa has to dictate how the arrangement works. Or at least there's a 40, there's a balance. There's either a 50-50 balance or a 40-60 balance. Africa dictates 40 and China dictates 60, whatever arrangement that
please
is.
Expand on that.
We have to be able to get involved.
Please expand on the coherent approach that you talked about earlier. You talked about, a merge of the AU and delegations. I want you to speak a little more on how we can do that.
Yeah, so it's very common. So even if we did not have a 6,000 member network of China experts, the arrangement would be this: get the Africans who have worked in China with Chinese folks who understand China or who study China as either China scholars, because we have a number of these researchers and scholars. Bring them under one single umbrella, galvanize with all the sub-regional organizations like ECOWAS and SADC, under the auspices of the African Union. Let them sit down and research areas of mutual benefits between the African continent and the Chinese continent, using the Agenda 2063 as the framework. So basically, we have a number of things that we want to achieve. We have a number of infrastructure that we want to be able to make sure that we bring online in the next 20, 30 years. We want to have a trans-African road highway. We want to have a trans-African rail network. We also want to have at least a couple of power grids, regional power grids that pulls into the general African power pool. And other core infrastructure projects as well. We want to also have an online digital marketplace, where people can buy and sell African goods under one auspices. A lot of these things would dictate our further arrangements, say, for instance, the next FOCAC summit that's happening in the next 3 years. Also, it will come up, it will be able to bring for us a coherent document. And that document should involve a number of the dictates that we want to see in terms of our relations with Africa. So de-risking, for instance, the credit lines that we're having access to in terms of from China. Also involving more of the African private sector. For the first time in nearly 24 years of our FOCAC summit engagements, the last FOCAC summit that just happened in Beijing was the first time we had an African private sector track, involved in that summit. We need to make sure that we double down on that. More of African private sector has to happen so that because that's actually the best way for technology transfer. The more African startups, the more African technology companies, the more other African companies are involved in these deals, the more they're able to, upskill their staffing, the more they're able to get technology from Beijing that they're able to use. Also, that allows for more ownership. When there's an African strategy, there's also an ownership of the project. So we don't have a situation where an entire infrastructure project is built in, say, Nasarawa, and 98% of that project is being handled by Chinese corporations. The staffing is about 95%. So where's the value when the taxes can't get paid in our lands, when our people cannot be upskilled to be able to handle these processing plants? For instance, a lithium processing plant in Nasarawa, in Kaduna, and 95% of the people at the plants are all Chinese. It doesn't make any sense. So with that coherent strategy, we're able to fast track this type of engagement. So Africa is not losing out, even though we know China is gaining. Africa is also gaining. They have more skilled workers. Labor productivity continues to increase, more tax revenues, because again, remember, with the more domestic revenue mobilization, the higher it is that we no longer are going to be at risk of a debt trap or being at risk of being beholden to Chinese debt. So this multiplier effect, this bidirectionality is only going to happen when we come up with that strategy, have the African technocrat class who are well aware of China, have done extensive work in Guangzhou and in Beijing and Hanoi, come on board to make that. And when you're able to see that document, then the next will be implementation. So you have to also fast track implementation.
All right. So in order to get that document, someone has to push for it. Who are those, in your mind, that should be in the forefront of advocating for these approach you talk about?
The African Union and the Pan-African Parliament also under the auspices.
But the African Union is inherently flawed. I mean, I've had conversations where people say that even at these kinds of forum, individual countries look out for personal interest, sometimes at the detriment of fellow African nations. So, and then AU can only present a consensus. So how do we work around that? Is it about strengthening the AU, perhaps the AU leadership with a little more power? How do we go about this?
We don't need to strengthen the AU with more power. What the AU already has that quality that we need for this arrangement with China to work. It's a consensus building framework. You know, it can gather heads of states. At least once a year, it gathers heads of states. And it can even do emergency heads of state meetings. That's more than enough galvanizing power, because that's the only organization that can do that. You know, obviously we would ask for them to also partner with the African Development Bank and a number of other Pan-African institutions. But just the African Union itself, including its Pan-African Parliament, which are basically African lawmakers under one umbrella, has that ability to galvanize. So when you are able to galvanize, then you can call these technocrats under, again, one umbrella, get them to work for over a year, do the research, come up with that strategy document. Once they bring up the strategy document, again, the AU is the only body that can have all or at least 90% of African states read that document and say they're adopting it. Once you adopt that strategy, the next work is the implementation. And I think for me, the approach for implementation, especially when it comes to Pan-African institutions, is to do the decentralization. And there are a number of bodies that can do the decentralization of the implementation of that African strategy for China.
I'm always optimistic when it comes to conversations about Africa uniting and, you know, making the right moves to get us from point A to point B in terms of development. Basil, as always, thank you very much for the insights you've provided.
Thank you very much, Felicity. It was a pleasure.